All right, so 7:30. Now we should get going, right? Thank you guys for being patient tonight while we had the High Mass for the Feast of St. Joseph. So, all right, where are we? What are we doing? I guess we should probably start with the logistics, right? So, okay, what is... If you want to mess with it and be my cameraman, you feel free. All right, what is this week, liturgically speaking?
The third week of Lent?
Third week of Lent, right? Or I guess it's technically the second week of Lent. This coming Thursday, or Sunday will be the third week of Lent. What is particular that starts on the third week of Lent on Sundays? Scrutinies. See, I told you, I'm going to keep telling you this till you get bored of it. And like, all right, so starting this Sunday, right, for the third, fourth, and fifth week, everybody who's being baptized is going to be at the 9:30 Mass, right, so that you can participate in the scrutinies, right? The scrutinies are a special thing for those who are getting baptized at Easter, right? So it's particular prayers for the people who are going to get baptized. It also includes some minor exorcisms each time. So if you've ever noticed, for instance, how many of you have been to a extraordinary form baptism? With an extraordinary form baptism, what do you do first?
Sorry, I've been...
You have had children baptized in the extraordinary form. So I should ask Sean. All right, Sean.
Start outside the church itself.
Mm-hmm. And then when you come down inside before the actual baptism, what happens?
Exorcism.
There's a bunch of exorcisms, right? In the Novus Ordo, in the new form of Mass, no, right? Why? What happened there? Actually, we moved the exorcisms from directly at baptism, and they kind of got blown out, right? So you get them spread out over 3 weeks in the Novus Ordo, and actually they get expanded from what you have in the extraordinary form. It's one of the few places where actually there is more in the Novus Ordo than there is in the extraordinary form. And so for all of you who are coming in to be baptized, you get more grace by getting that spread out across all 3 weeks and asking more. We ask more from God for you. We're going to ask for you regardless, but you're better off if you're there to receive the scrutinies, right? So what's going to happen is this will be between the homily and the beginning of the liturgy of the Eucharist. Father will call all of you to come up front with your sponsor, and then there'll be a little thing, you just do what he says. It'll vary a little bit from week to week. So like, 1 week there's going to be an ephathra, let you be open, and he's going to sign your ears, right? Things like that. So, bunch of special things. That make sense? Everybody who's going to be baptized is going to be there on Sunday?
Where? Which church?
Here, 9:30 a.m. at the 9:30 a.m. Mass.
There's a chance my sponsor might be out of town.
Yeah.
It's okay. If your sponsor is out of town, I will stand in behind you. I actually managed to not be a sponsor so far this year, so I am available to stand in.
So the sponsors have to be there if you're there?
Sponsors don't have to be there.
Mm-hmm.
We can stand in with somebody else.
Okay.
They do have to be there at Easter, but I can stand in, or Maggie may be there to stand in. Can have the other people stand in. Abs.
How many people can you stand in for at once?
I have stood in for up to 3 people at once. Not ideal. I'd like to only do it for 1, but I did do the moving down the line 1 year. So, all right. Any other logistical comments or questions? How did the rite of election go? I missed that because I was in London, right?
It was really cool.
It's fun to see everybody from all the different parishes, and at the end, everybody holding up their books up in the
Mhm.
front. It was just really cool. It was a great image.
I heard that it was pretty full this year.
Oh,
There was a lot of people.
Lots of people.
Well, you know, it's nice to see the church growing,
Yeah.
right? I thought that whole Christianity thing was dead, like it had been buried, right?
Is there an official number for how many catechumens went this year? Because I know last year's like 244.
I'm sure that there is an official number. I do not, however, know what it is.
I'm just curious.
It's around
See if it's growing,
1,500,
if it's
they
growing.
said.
wow.
For the Archdiocese, 1,500?
Yeah, because, and then, the church itself holds about 3,500. So with the sponsor, that's about 3,000. So we had about like 3,500 people there at the cathedral. Oh, yeah.
That is a lot.
Yeah.
Huge. I wish I had a video of that.
And I was singing for that many people?
You were.
You
Abs,
did
can
a
you
good
close the
job.
door? All right. With that, we should probably jump into our topic for the night. I'm going to try to be a bit briefer. If you all have been here with me teaching, you know that's probably going to be hard for me, but we're going to try. All right. So today we are in the section on the moral life of the Christian, right? I think we've gotten through the section on the virtues, the vices, sin, right? And today we're going to talk about the human community, which you might be like, that's kind of weird. What does the human community have to do with the moral life, right? When are you going to get to telling me about the law, things like that? That's going to be next, right, once we get through the human community. But we as moral creatures are connected to one another. And so we have duties, obligations, and right living in relation to each other. Somebody want to read for us question number 401?
The question is, in what does the social dimension of man consist? Oh, you would read the answer.
Whole thing.
Together with the personal call to beatitude, the human person has a communal dimension as an essential component of his nature and vocation. Indeed, all are called to the same end, God himself. There is a certain resemblance between the communion of the divine persons and the fraternity that people are to establish among themselves in truth and love. Love of neighbor is inseparable from love of God, love for God.
That's great. Thank you. So you can see we said that if you go back to the beginning of the moral life, we said we're made in the image of God, right? And that's what gives us our moral qualities. The image of God. How is it that God is also communal? Trinity, right? One God in three persons, right? And so God himself exists in eternal beatitude with himself, right? The three persons of the Trinity loving one another and in community with one another for all eternity, right? And so that's why it says there is a certain resemblance between the communion of the divine persons and the fraternity that people are to establish among themselves in truth and in love, right? Because we worship a God who is one God in three persons, there is a social dimension. We're not independent from one another. Being made in his image means that we are intimately connected one with another, right? In a mystical sort of way. That's not to say that we are one God, three persons, right? But we're connected to each other. And we have fraternity, brotherhood with one another, right? And so in the same way that love within the persons of the Trinity exists from all eternity, we are to have love with one another, right? If you are to be mirroring the way that God himself is, then you must love your brother in the same way that God loves himself in community. Does that make sense? It's a very deep concept, but an important one. This is actually one of the things that sets Christianity apart even from other monotheistic religions, right? Because, for instance, the Jews believe in one God, right? They believe in the Ten Commandments, all those sorts of things, but they don't have the same sort of social understanding of the relationship between people. That being made in the divine image means being connected with each other because they don't believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. Same sort of thing when you get into Islam, right? It's a unique part of Christianity. Let's read number 402. What is the relationship between the person and society? The human person is and ought to be the principle, the subject, and the end of all social institutions. Certain societies, such as the family and the civic community, are necessary for the human person. Also helpful are other associations of the national and international levels with due respect for the principle of subsidiarity. All right, so here the compendium talks about two kinds of communities. Those which are necessary and not necessary but good. What are the necessary communities? Family. And? Civic community. What's that civic community?
Like civilized community?
Okay. What would that community be?
The city, the state.
Yeah, the city, the state, right?
Your
Um,
localized community?
Hmm?
Would it be like your localized communities?
Yeah, so it's not even necessarily just a localized community, right? Civic community starts in cities, right? But like civil society, we would talk about, would extend not just to our city government, but also to our state government, our national government, all of those sorts of things, right? So this is like civil society, our governments, if you will, right? And the compendium says those things are necessary. Some Christian traditions would say, hey, civil government is only a product of the fall, right? We only need government because of sin. Sin exists to restrain evil, to, punish that sort of thing. But the compendium here talks about how, even in the unfall, it's necessary for man to come together. First in the family, and then in broader civil societies. So let's kind of draw this a little bit. All right, here I am. Here's a G, and let's do an A, since, my daughter's here, right? And let's see, we'll do another A. This will be AA. Alex, right? And JA. He was around here somewhere, right? And then let's go, maybe I've got some friends. I've got a friend Pasquale who lives over in Italy, if you will, right? All right, so we're all individual people, right? But the compendium says we form social societies. What sort of society might G and A? We'll do GM and AM. What's our society?
Familial.
Right? This is the Mech family. Right? How about over here?
Adamson family.
Adamson family. And then from the Mechs and the Adamsons, what might a bigger thing that the Mechs and the Adamsons are a part of?
Star of the Sea. Oh, civic, you mean like civic?
Yeah, so maybe we're all a part of San Francisco, And you could then go bigger, right? California. And then you go bigger,
United States.
USA. And then over here, I can have a whole nother thing in Italy, right?
The world.
The world. There actually are world institutions. What are some world institutions?
The World Health Organization.
Yeah, the World Health Organization, the United Nations. Now, would those fall under necessary things?
No.
So the compendium talks about there are other helpful associations on the national and international levels, right? That are good, helpful, free associations, if you will. But generally, Catholic teaching would kind of end it at country is the thing that's necessary, if you will. Does that make sense? Connections? And then the same sort of thing would exist in the ecclesial realm, right? Where I could do, the Mechs and the Adamsons are not only connected to SF, what else are they connected to?
Parish.
Star of the Sea. We're all members of Star of the Sea. And what's Star of the Sea a member of?
Archdiocese.
Yeah. Arch of SF. Is there any levels above the Archdiocese of SF?
Conference,
Yeah, USCCB.
or the Conference of California, and then the Conference of the US.
And then broader than that, you could go across the whole world,
The Pope.
right? The whole world, all the way over here, which is Catholic Church. And that's one of the things that we would recognize a difference in the civil order versus the ecclesiastical order, is that the civil order, there is a government that spans across the totality of the world, which is the Catholic Church. Does that make sense? All right, so you've got families, you've got governments. Those are the only kinds then of associations that should exist, right?
No.
Bowling league.
Bowling league, that'd be another good one, right? Or, how many of you guys work for companies? Those are civic societies, not like literal governments, right? But associations that you come together, right? And so you're composed and there's an authority involved. Are there rules in relation to your job?
No.
Is there a legitimate authority your job can make rules about and then you're obligated to obey? Yeah, right? These are good voluntary associations, right? And this is all a part of the order which God established, that we're to form these unions together, right? Have communion with each other and be subject to authority within those unions. Does that make sense? Any comments or questions on that? All right, now we hit the first principle. There are two key principles in relation to Catholic social teaching. So how we relate to one another, that's social teaching. There's two principles: subsidiarity and solidarity. Those are kind of the two key principles of Catholic social teaching. First one we're going to come to is subsidiarity, and solidarity comes at the very end of the lesson. It's the last question in the compendium. So, somebody want to read for us question 403. What is the principle of subsidiarity?
The principle of subsidiarity states that a community of a higher order should not assume the task belonging to a community of a lower order and deprive it of its authority. It should rather support it in case of need.
All right, so it now says there are higher orders and lower orders. What's a higher order?
State, the United States and states.
So maybe what's the lowest order?
Family.
Individual.
Individual.
Okay? And then one level up from that would be family. And then we're going to start branching, right? SF, Star of the Sea, CA, Arch, US, USCCB, etc. Right? So it goes from the lowest level, which is the individual, up towards the highest level, which, in the ecclesial realm would be the whole Catholic Church, rules made by the Pope. Right? So that's the lower and the higher order. And what restraint does the compendium say is upon those higher orders relative to the lower orders?
Should not take its authority of the local subsidiary.
Right. It should not assume the task belonging to a community of a lower order, and in so doing, deprive it of its authority. What do you think that principle is getting at?
Don't micromanage.
At a high level, one of the problems you would have if you do things is kind of micromanaging,
Yeah.
right? So what level should rules be made at?
The level that affects them.
The lowest possible level and no lower. Notice how I put that last part in, right? The lowest possible level and no lower. So you want to say, is this something which the lower level is possible of taking care of? If the answer to that question is yes, that lies with the authority of the local level. If the answer to that question is no, there is a benefit to the broader whole, right, in being in the higher level, it goes to the higher level. So let's talk about this in relation to church law, right? What are the sorts of things that the parish of Star of the Sea does not have authority over, and it would be wrong for it to start taking authority?
Doctrine.
Well, that's going
You're
up.
going
Go
down,
down
right?
first.
How many children every family should have?
How many children every family should have? All right. Pastor decides, I am going to make a law. Everybody within my church is going to have at least 8 children. Is that within the authority of the... No, right? How about, I'm going to make a law. All of your children must be catechized by the Baltimore Catechism. You have to do that every night. Make sure you're catechizing your children. Can a pastor of a parish do that?
No.
Because who's the first responsibility in relation to catechesis?
Parents.
The parents, right? Now, can the pastor go, I recommend that you should use the Baltimore Catechism. The Baltimore Catechism is the best catechism that I know of, right? And it's really important for you, parents, to catechize your children.
Yeah.
In fact, that's a good thing for the pastor of the parish to do, right? To say, this is a super important thing. I'm going to give you the tools. I'm going to recommend the things you should do, all of that sort of thing. But he can't make a law and impose it as a rule, right, that would bind the conscience. Now, how about as a parent, right? You go, I'm going to make my children memorize the Baltimore Catechism. Is that tyranny on the part of the parents? My daughter seems to have an opinion.
Yes.
No. Because God has given that authority to the parents, right? In fact, telling them, train up your child in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it, right? You are responsible for catechizing your children. And so I make rules, if you will, in relation to that sort of thing. That make sense? So you want to push it to the lowest possible level and no lower. Another example of this, where you get into like unified things, what are things that we impose up here at the level of the Catholic Church?
The order of the Mass.
Order of the Mass. Wait a second, isn't that tyranny? Saying these are the words you're going to say in relation to Mass?
No.
Shouldn't that be up to the individual pastor to choose his own language and words when he prays?
Well, isn't he under the authority of the archdiocese?
What if he doesn't know the language that the Pope wants him to speak in?
That happened for a long time when we said the Mass in Latin, right? That was one of the things you were supposed to learn in seminary. Didn't always do the greatest job at it. But is that okay? Can Catholic Church make that a universal norm? Protestants kind of object to that, don't they? You can't tell me what language I have to use in my prayers. So this is disposing the good that makes no... The Mass, right? The language at which we pray isn't subject to circumstances, right? There's not something about, in country 1 or in country 2, the goods to be acquired through the Mass vary by circumstances. It's the same everywhere. Christ established one church, right? And therefore, those goods to be attained don't vary from circumstances, which means actually the place that decision should be made is at the universal level, because the things that it's governing are universal principles. So for example, then you get into talking about like government, right? Is it okay for the national government to say it's never permissible to commit murder?
Yes.
It is, right? Why? Because the principle that it's making a rule about is universal. Irrespective of circumstances, murder is never okay. Therefore, it's within the higher level authority to make that decision. So you want to push it down as low as you can, right? So that you get closest to the circumstances that are at hand. But then you don't want to say, oh, this isn't a universal principle. This needs to be governed locally when it's not actually a universal. It doesn't vary from circumstance to circumstance. That's the principle of subsidiarity. Any questions there?
What is the Catholic point of view on church and state? Like, should we should be a Catholic kingdom? What are we doing?
We'll talk about that in a minute. Any questions on subsidiarity? Lowest possible level, but no lower. Abigail.
Does that mean if, like, I don't do something that you tell me to, you can't go to it, like, as a lawsuit?
So the court of original jurisdiction, if you will, in the family lies with the parents. So I could bring you a lawsuit with mommy, you could say, right? But in that regard, the state of San Francisco, right, doesn't have jurisdiction to reach in and say, these are the rules that can or can't exist in your house. Because those rules are governed by circumstances. This is why, for instance, to just give one more example, the Catholic Church generally is very positive towards things like voucher programs. This is actually flowing out of the principle of subsidiarity. Because who has the primary responsibility in relation to the education of their children?
The teachers?
The parents, right? So it actually lives at the family level to make decisions about education. And so the Catholic Church would generally say to go up levels there and say the state, for instance, gets to determine the content of, what happens in education. Generally, the Catholic Church has said, no, that belongs to parents. The state still has a role to play. It should be supplementing, supporting, providing funds, making sure everybody gets access to education, etc. But the decision lies with parents. And when we say the decision lies with parents, we mean the responsibility lies with parents too, right? Whatever level the decision lies at is the level that gets the accountability for it. So parents, if you don't end up educating your children to the level at which they should be, you get the accountability as well.
Kind of similar to the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, actually.
It is. In fact, it's grounded in the same sort of idea, right? Anything that's not explicitly given here stays with the people. All right, Abs.
Does that mean if the teachers don't actually educate the kids, but that the parents think they do, the parents are still responsible?
The parents are still responsible. In fact, that's one of the things if you were to come to Stella Maris Academy, right? Or I assume Nativity, we view our things as a partnership with the parents, right? And we explicitly talk about how the parents are the primary educators. And the teachers are at service of the parents because God is ultimately going to hold them accountable. Now we entrust our children to schools, right? Recognizing that there are people with capabilities that are better at this than us, right? And it's good to form societies that do those sorts of things. But you never want the school to replace the parent. This is a problem that can happen sometimes where parents outsource all the things to the school, right? And they go, oh, that's the school's job, not my job. They check out, and then, kids are having a hard time, and they go, why aren't you serving my kids better? All right, any other questions on subsidiarity? All right, let's keep going then. 404, what else is required for an authentic human society? Authentic human society requires respect for justice, a just hierarchy of values, and the subordination of material and instinctual dimensions to the interior and spiritual ones. In particular, where sin has perverted the social climate, it is necessary to call for the conversion of hearts and for the grace of God to obtain social changes that may really serve each person and the whole person. Charity, which requires and makes possible the practice of justice, is the greatest social commandment. All right, I'm just going to pick out a couple things here. So, authentic human society, in terms of justice, requires the subordination of material and instinctual dimensions to interior and spiritual ones. What's that mean?
Needs to provide things that your body needs, shelter.
Okay,
food.
so material things, right? Material. Food. Shelter. Any other things?
Well, it's so many things, right?
iPhones.
Healthcare.
Transportation, roads. ...
You can imagine, right? There's an ongoing down there in relation to material things. And you need society to, in respect for justice, right, help to provide and set up those things for the common good. So there's material and instinctual dimensions. Instinctual means I am hungry, right? If I don't have food, I get hungry. That's my instinct, right? Shelter. If I don't have shelter, what am I going to get? Cold,
Sick.
right? Sick. Healthcare. I'm going to die, right? Those are the material well-being. And then it also talks about not just material and instinctual dimensions, but what? Interior and spiritual. What are some of those? Spiritual well-beings.
Church.
What about church? Ability to worship, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, worship.
Would you include art in that?
Apprehension of beauty, sure.
Prayer.
Sinning?
Yeah.
Maybe forgiveness from sins, right? Salvation? That's a spiritual good. Don't want to go to hell. That's a good one.
Would sacraments fall into that?
Yeah, sacraments, right? Growth in grace. All right, so we've got these spiritual and these material. Which one's more important?
Spiritual.
Spiritual is more important. 1, 2, right? And notice the compendium here says, authentic human society requires a respect for justice and a just hierarchy of values. So if I were to put these in hierarchy, which one goes above the other?
The spiritual.
The spiritual, right? Which is why it says it requires the subordination of the material and instinctual dimensions to interior and spiritual ones. Right? These are more important. These aren't bad, right? These are goods that we ought to be striving in justice to attain. But when there are trade-offs between 1 and 2, the just society should pick which one?
One.
All right, what's hard about that?
Doesn't seem like we do that.
In what way?
Well, when I think of the city, right, I don't think the city provides much of number one. A lot of things related to material, but not spiritual.
Yeah, so today we live in a very materialistic society, right? Where we sometimes, at least in relation to certain realms, only regard the material as the goods to be attained, right? And we would put these sorts of goods, the spiritual, outside of the sphere of civil society, right? That's for the church. That's not for any other societies.
Do you mind if I ask a question?
Mhm.
It's saying the authentic human society requires respect, so requires of its individuals?
And of the society as a whole. Because society exists not just in the choices of the individuals, but the laws which we make, right? Which move towards a common good.
Right, but I'm hungry. That doesn't, if I not have to subjugate to the spiritual value if I don't get to rob you.
Yeah, but it's more than that, right? We'll talk, this is in the common good section. But like, society has an obligation to each of the individuals within it, every society, to enable them to attain the goods which they need, both spiritual and material. So like, for example, I'm going to have laws around stealing in my society, right? I'm going to maybe have laws around things like not allowing gouging during natural disasters so that you can't hoard particular things, right? I'm going to set up laws that make it where you're more likely and able to grow things and sell them to each other so that everybody's able to get food. I'm creating human laws to attain those goods. Or maybe in relation to health, right? Might I want to say, I want to regulate things that are good for you and bad for you, medicines that you're going to take, right? So that you can know, this is like what the FDA does, right? These drugs work. These drugs don't work.
That violates subsidiarity though, because you're not putting any responsibility on me. Like if I want to put fentanyl in my neck, is it your job as the arranger of society to make sure I don't do that at all costs? Like, I mean,
my job as the arranger of society is try to optimize the goods. And when you look at, say, should you have fentanyl in your neck, that's not a individual decision. That's a universal decision. It applies equally irrespective of circumstances. So that's why we have things like the FDA to regulate, right? Those sorts of things. Catholic social teaching in this regard is not libertarian, right?
Yeah, I understand that, but there's fundamental tension, even ethically or spiritually, between what enables the individual to, in their walk with God, develop, and you can't take away someone's consequence for their decisions, right? So
there's much prudence in terms of writing laws, right? There's no black and white, these are good laws, these are, there's prudence in terms of discerning how to attain the ends that you're talking about, right?
Right.
So I wouldn't want to say, like, in all cases, we want a national government to regulate all of these sorts of things, except there's prudence.
Yeah.
But the goods to be attained when they are common belong up in the hierarchy there. So, but okay, going back to this, right? The spiritual goods are higher than the material goods. And that's the important thing for us to do. We do this in families, right? Those of you who are parents, if you have to pick between spiritual goods and material goods, you should pick spiritual goods, right? If you had to pick, your child is going to attain salvation, your child is not going to be hungry. Which one do you want? It's hard, right?
Give us an example of that. Your dad.
Yeah. So one of the things that I teach my kids, for instance, we're in Lent, right? You want your kids to be satisfied, hungry, but sometimes it's good to deny yourself food as you're fasting, right? And you're going, hey, we're going to be fasting on Ash Wednesday, let's say, right? Or Good Friday. I have to be prudent so that I don't go too far because kids can't take, the big fast, right? But it's like, what are you going to give up for Lent, right? You're going to deny yourself these material goods for the end of attaining a spiritual good.
Here's another thought, choosing a school for your children, one that would get them a really good job, lots of money, or one that would enable them to hold their faith, maintain their faith. Now you want both, of course, but if you had to choose Harvard or heaven, which one do you choose? You have to choose a school that's going to ultimately get them to heaven. Of course, we have schools here, Stella Maris and Nativity, who aim to do both. I mean, we try to get people to heaven and to Harvard, but a lot of times you can't do both, so you have to make a choice.
Yeah, and when you have to make a choice, you pick spiritual above material.
When you think, when I think of like the United States having separation of church and state, I think it's an interesting thing to ponder. I guess the United States wasn't founded by Catholics.
Well, so I think that part of the challenge that comes in there is oftentimes when we talk about the separation of church and state today, it doesn't mirror very closely the separation of church and state that you found at the founding, right? So like First Amendment of the Constitution says, you shall not establish any religion. Today people kind of go like, see, that means that civil government needs to be entirely out, right? Agnostic at best, if not atheistic, you get in a lot of spheres, right? But 9 of the original 13 states actually had established churches. In 11 of the original 13 states, you could not hold office unless you were a Christian.
Wow.
Wait, isn't that a separation of church and state? Well, the people who wrote it didn't seem to think it was, right? I think Father every Thanksgiving tends to read from Lincoln, right?
Sometimes Washington.
Sometimes Washington, right? Where originally, right, we called for a day of thanksgiving to thank God in his providence for the good graces which he has bestowed upon the United States. That's putting spiritual needs up, right? Now, we learned from, what happened in Europe in relation to the Catholic-Protestant wars and the things that came out of that. Sometimes spiritual flourishing doesn't come from recognizing one and only one church, which is the disestablishment clause, right? But still, the country historically placed an important value upon the spiritual needs of its people. I think it was Adams, for instance, who said, our Constitution is made only for a Christian people, right?
Yeah.
And if you get rid of the virtue in Christianity, our Constitution's not going to work.
Right.
I don't want to go too political there, right? But I think the important thing is that like in justice, in harmony there, we want to prize the spiritual over the material. All right. Did Donica or somebody over there have another hand up?
I was going to make a point, but maybe it's off topic. But what I was going to say was if we focus on the number ones, the number twos will figure themselves out.
Yes.
But I just walked in on this side.
No.
Yeah, you focus on the ones, the twos tend to work themselves out, right?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that also be the same thing as saying authentic individuals would make an authentic society? Like,
Yeah. Authentic individuals tend to make an authentic society, which I think comes a little bit, and we'll just do this and then we'll keep moving. in particular where sin has perverted the social climate. It doesn't just pervert individuals, right? It is often necessary to call for the conversion of hearts and for the grace of God to obtain societal changes that may really serve each person and the whole person. So it's not just that we oftentimes, in wanting to have a healthy society, need to change the laws, need to change the rules, right? In fact, the real thing that we generally need is conversion of heart, right? And the grace of God to be at work in the individuals of the society so that it takes on the shape that it ought to have. All right, any other questions there? All right, I'm going to keep moving. 405, and then we're going to jump around a little bit. What is the foundation of the authority of society? Every human community needs a legitimate authority that preserves order and contributes to the realization of the common good. The foundation of such authority lies in human nature because it corresponds to the order established by God. All right, so every one of these circles, right? The compendium says needs what? A legitimate authority. Right? What does that authority mean? If you were to read the catechism on here, it says that authority means the ability to make rules, right? To do what it says here, preserve order and contribute to the realization of the common good. So every level of these sorts of things, whether it's civil society or organizations that aren't in the state, etc., it requires some degree of authority. Does that make sense? Authority is not a bad thing. Authority is a good thing. We want authority. We want rules. We want laws in so much as they lead us to the common good. We're people that are naturally shaped and formed by laws in this regard, right? And you'll note it says that the foundation of such authority lies in human nature because it corresponds to the order established by God. What does that mean?
Since human beings are made in the image of God, us conforming ourselves to his will is in part obeying his laws.
Mm-hmm. And if obeying his laws includes be subject to authorities, right? That authority is a divinely instituted thing. So like, for instance, St. Paul in Romans 13 says to be subject. Be subject to authorities, for there is no authority but that which is established by God. Right? And then he says that the authority does not wield the sword unlawfully, if you will. Forgetting the exact language there, right? Authorities are established by God. Which means they're not social constructs. What does that mean, social constructs?
It's like a product of society.
Yeah, it's not that it's a product of society. We collectively agree to particular sorts of things. Any society intrinsically has an authority in it, and that authority comes from God. Now, we might choose to structure that society in a democratic way. We might choose to structure that authority in a monarchical way, right? So, like, for instance, in our civil society, the way that that authority is exercised is a constitutional republic, right? Democratically. In the church, how is that authority exercised?
Oligarchy?
Not oligarchy. Sometimes we might feel that way in our lesser moments. But a monarchy, right? Who's the head of the Catholic Church?
The Pope.
Which means supreme legislative authority lies with him, whether we like it or not. Sometimes we like it, sometimes we might, I wish he had a little bit more prudence. But it's legitimate authority, if you will, in that regard.
It's an important point that the church is not a democracy, because Americans were all Democrats, right? Or Republicans. I mean, they mean the same thing.
Same thing, yeah.
Both Republic and Democrat means rule by the people. But So there's no Congress in the Vatican, there's no representatives, there's no elections, and you can't change church teaching by popular vote. So it's, try to get your head about that, around that the church is not a democracy. And Americans would say, well, that must be bad, because only democracy is good, right? It's the only legitimate way to run a community. But it's not the only legitimate way. Now, both can be abused.
Absolutely.
I mean, the democratic republic can be abused when certain elites get in power and convince everybody else that they should do whatever they say. But also, a monarchy, the monarchy of the king gets messed up, so.
Isn't there limits though, like in the foundational physics of it though? Because yes, it's a monarchy. I understand that, and it's not like I would want otherwise.
So like question 406, right? When is the authority exercised in a legitimate way? There are legitimate ways and there are illegitimate ways to exercise authority, right?
Like the Pope could not tell the Catholic body of Christ to do something against.
Well, see, the
The
monarch
scripture.
is not the Pope. He's the viceroy of the monarch. The monarch is Christ. That's the only thing that makes the church work. And if the viceroy ever rebels against the monarch,
Okay, that makes sense.
he gets fired.
Which is why 406, for instance, says unjust laws and measures contrary to the moral order are not binding in the conscience.
I see.
Right? So like if the Pope said, every man must marry 3 women. Okay? You go, I respect your authority as the vicar of Christ, but you're contrary to Christ here. Right? And so that doesn't bind the conscience. Right? But if he said, you can only get married in churches, well, that does bind the conscience, right? Because that's not contrary to the moral order. That's governing circumstances around it. Okay. Anything else? Oh, one more thing. We were talking about this. How does authority work in this section, in the family?
I find that that's the easiest one to see the hand of God in authority, right? Because obviously the parents have to.
It's the wife.
It's the parents and the children, right? You don't have. You don't
At the
wanna
very
give
least, it's
authority
the
to
parents, right? The parents have authority over the children, right? And that authority is not democratic. So, like, I have 6 kids. They outnumber us, right? If the 6 kids vote, this is the way we think this should be going. What do you think?
The kids should do it.
Nope. Right? In fact, right, St. Paul says the husband is the head of every wife in the same way that Christ is the head of the church. Ultimately, the buck stops with the husband in a divine ordered way there, right? Not because the husband is superior and like everything he does is right? But because that's the order which God established for the family. That's why he says, wives, be subject to your husbands as unto the Lord. And then husbands, love your wives.
I have some more bad news for you guys. The church is a patriarchy.
But the nice thing there to keep it is good news because like ultimately the authority that comes with it comes with authority, it comes with responsibility, right? Because it says, wives, be subject to your husbands as unto the Lord. And then what is the command that Paul gives to husbands immediately after that?
Love your wives as Christ loved the church.
And laid down his life for her, right? And so the fact that husbands, you have been made heads of your family means you have a responsibility to be like Jesus, be willing to lay down yourself for him. Which, the first part of that, wives, be subject to your husbands, that's hard. I think the second one's harder. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and give yourself up for her. So, Abigail.
What are the kids in charge of?
What are the kids in charge of? Well, there's a commandment that God gives to them. Honor your father and mother.
Is that your way of saying we're in charge of them?
No. It's saying you're subject to them, right?
Then what are they in charge of?
All right, we can talk later.
He'll tell you, don't worry. Not much, kid.
Well, they're in charge of their own soul, right?
They are in charge of, like, ultimately you are accountable for yourself, right?
Yeah.
But then the next sphere up is accountable to order things, if you will, Mac. I'm going to move on. You can talk to me on the way home. I'm going to exercise my parental authority. All right. Let's move on. We're going to move through the rest somewhat quickly because we started pretty late today. 4:11. How does society ensure social justice? Society ensures social justice when it respects the dignity and rights of the person as the proper end of society itself. Furthermore, society pursues social justice when it is linked to the common good and to the exercise of authority, when it provides the conditions that allow associations and individuals to obtain what is their due. It's kind of a complicated thing to talk about there, right? Yes. But here's the way that the structure of society is ordered. It's what happens at the end, right? The job of higher societies is to provide the conditions that allow the lower societies, associations, and individuals to obtain what is their due. What is that? That which is due to them. It's these goods, right? Like, the fact that you are hungry means that there actually is a due injustice for you to be able to eat. Right? Now, that doesn't mean you have an absolute right in all regards. St. Paul says, let he who doesn't work, he shouldn't eat. Right? So a worker is to work so that he gets his food, but you are due the circumstances which enable you to provide and to eat. Sean?
So that would be, say, with Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, the idea of discussing the distribution of land to each. Not that we're just going to feed everyone, like the higher order should be feeding everyone, but no, give them the means to provide for themselves.
Exactly, right? Then you notice that would be an inversion. If the highest orders said what we're going to do is we're going to feed all the people, that actually would not be just. Because what the higher orders are to do is to provide the conditions that allow the association and individuals to obtain what is their due. Right? So to help, not to provide, if you will, in that regard. Abs.
Does that mean we shouldn't give food to the homeless?
No, that can be a very good act of charity, right? But in relation to our societies, we want to actually set it up so that they can obtain what is due to them through their work and their labor, right? Which is why, like, our first duty in relation to those who lack shelter or lack food, we should be helping them and providing for them out of charity, but we want to enable them to get to a place where they can obtain food, shelter, healthcare, all of those sorts of things, right? And also, you'll note not just the material goods, but the spiritual goods, right? You want a society that is going to provide the conditions that allows association and individuals to obtain not just material goods, but spiritual goods. So you want the promoting, right? The establishing of rules that lead toward the obtaining of the spiritual. And obtaining the spiritual above the material. Any comments or questions there? All right, I'm going to jump to the last one since we're about out of time. How is human solidarity manifested? Solidarity, which springs from human and Christian brotherhood, is manifested in the first place by the just distribution of goods, by a fair remuneration for work, and by zeal for a more just social order. The virtue of solidarity also practices the sharing of the spiritual goods of faith, which is even more important than the sharing of material goods. So the idea of solidarity here, right? Subsidiarity is going which level of the thing should basically attain it. Solidarity is saying because we all spring from humanity, we're all part of the one Christian brotherhood, right? we want to see justice obtained not only for ourselves, but for our kin, right? Which is all humankind at its basis. And so we want to see a just distribution of goods, which doesn't mean an equal distribution of goods, but one that is just and benefits the society as a whole, right? A fair remuneration for work. So when our brother is not receiving a fair remuneration, such that he is able to obtain the material and spiritual goods, we want to go, that's not okay. We want to live in our brother's shoes and go, we want to reorder our society so that all people can obtain those goods which God has laid out for them. This is a solidarity we share with one another. And so it's not just, I got mine, I'm happy, right? True happiness can consist only in everybody obtaining what is theirs. Does that make sense? And then notice again, you see the same sort of hierarchy between the material and the spiritual. The virtue of solidarity also practices the sharing of spiritual goods of faith, which is even more important than the sharing of material goods. So it's even more important for you to want your brethren to obtain that which is spiritual, to attain salvation, right? That's the solidarity we all have. Christ died not only for our sins, but for the sins of the entire world. So we want everybody to obtain that good at the highest level. That's why the church cares so much about evangelism, right? It's because we want our brothers and sisters to obtain that highest good. All right, any comments or questions there? Solidarity. Abs.
Does that apply to any random person?
Does it apply? What do you mean?
I mean, if you don't know the guy, but he's like complaining about his work under his breath, then you should like report it.
It's not a matter of reporting it. It's wanting to try to help them, right? Wanting to see society ordered and structured such that he's able to obtain. So like, he's not able to obtain food or shelter, right? You want to be able to sit in his shoes, go, what are the things that are keeping him from being able to get there? How do I work towards more orienting our society so that he's able to obtain those things?
For one person?
For everybody. Solidarity talks about humankind as a whole altogether. It's not caring about the levels of where it lives, right? It's the care that he's able to obtain it. And the same thing, not just in terms of is he able to obtain food or shelter, but can he attain salvation as the highest spiritual good? And how can I order my societies to obtain that end? All right. Practice for today. The practice for today is tithing and works of mercy. Who can tell me what a tithe is? Tithe comes from the Hebrew word tenth, right? So in the Old Testament, the Jews were to tithe a certain amount of everything that they had, right, to God. Is that just an Old Testament principle?
Isn't that like the money you give regularly to the institution?
Yeah. So generally, the way that the church has said is that principle of a tenth is something that's bound up in the moral created order, not necessarily just tied to, the Judaic covenant, if you will, in that regard. And so when we talk about tithing, we're saying God is owed 1/10 of our increase. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to give, 10% of every paycheck to the particular church, right? But it's saying that God owns 1/10 of the things that we do. And so it's our spiritual joy and duty to render that 10th back to him. It's already what he has. He owns it, right? I'm just giving it back to him. And it's actually a very good spiritual principle as well, to have this be proportional in giving, because then if it goes up or it goes down, God's the one causing it to go up, he gets more. God's the one who causes it to go down, you go, okay, Lord, you're not taking as much right now, right?
He's the largest shareholder in you.
But he is. He owns all of it, and actually, like, God actually owns all that we get in the increase. And he's very generous to us, and he says, you can keep 9/10, right? You render back to me
He's a
1/10.
flat tax guy.
Flat tax, if you will.
So you
in that
know the
regard.
U.S. Constitution, well, the U.S. government is based on, respects the Old Testament idea of tithing because of nonprofits. What is a nonprofit? It's something you tithe to. And the government respects that. They honor the tithe. So the churches are nonprofits, all sorts of NGOs and educational associations. There's a lot more secular nonprofits than religious nonprofits. But that's just a proof that it's evidence of the deeply Judeo-Christian nature of our republic.
And again, actually, if you go back to the founding, the government collected it and distributed it to the church. You didn't even have a choice. You still find this in certain places in Europe, which perhaps is not that good of a means to do it, because like part of the reason why Germany is so rich in the church is because it still is set up to tithe. And so you just get 10% taken out of your paycheck, sent to the church that you designate. Perhaps produces some bad effects where you have additional wealth, right? So maybe it's better to do a free gift, but it still is
Tax-free.
Yeah, it's tax-free. So the government actually, any money that you give in a tithing sort of way doesn't count towards your income, because they assume that's the duty that you have to God first, spiritual and then material.
Now, God in the Old Testament asked for a tenth. How much does the U.S. government ask or take from us? More than 10.
Much more. Well, I guess it depends on your income. Takes less for certain subsets.
I don't think it
but-
ever drops below 10%.
Well, it can go to 0. So
The ITC is negative.
yeah. Any case, so that's tithing, and then works of mercy. What would be examples of works of mercy?
Volunteer work.
Volunteer work, like what?
Helping the program feed the homeless.
Yeah, it's basically like when you look at a person, you have mercy on them, right? You're wanting them to be provided for. So one of the things we do, for instance, as a church is on Sundays, we take food down to the Tenderloin, right? There's a group of people who make, I think it's sandwiches. Is that right, Father?
Yeah.
And we take it down. Those are mercy that you're doing. It's not a matter of justice, it's mercy, if you will, in that regard. And particularly in the season of Lent, those sorts of works of mercy are things we should be thinking, how can I do that? How can I be helpful? Where can I find a way to be merciful to my brothers? And do those works of mercy. All right, I'm going to call it there because we're already 5 minutes over. We did start 40 minutes late, so maybe we got through it pretty quick.
Did you talk about the scrutinies?
Yes,
Okay, good. So we're all on board 9:30 Mass this Sunday.
9:30 Mass this Sunday. All right, Father, you want to close this prayer?
May the blessing of Almighty God be with you now and always, through the intercession of good Saint Joseph, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone for food.